Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this week's Round the Table. We are now entering the penultimate chapter in Mark, chapter 15. So, Edmund, I will share my screen. Just give me a moment. Hi, Sigun. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good evening, everybody.
Hello.
Too many windows open, sorry guys. Right. There, I finally found it amongst the many windows that were open. So, Edmundo, could you read Mark 15, 1 to 15, please?
Yeah. As soon as it was morning, the head priest held a council meeting with the elders, the Torah teachers, and the whole Sanhedrin. Then they put Yeshua in chains, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate put this question to him: "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "The words are yours." The head priest too made accusations against him, and Pilate again inquired of him, "Aren't you going to answer? Look how many charges they're making against you." But Yeshua made no further response, to Pilate's amazement. Now, during a festival, Pilate used to set free one prisoner, whomever the crowd requested. There was, in prison, among the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection, a man called Barabbas. When the crowd came up and began asking Pilate to do for them what he usually did, he asked them, excuse me, "Do you want me to set free for you the king of the Jews?" For it was evident to him that it was out of jealousy that the head priest had handed him over. But the head priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate again said to them, "Then what should I do with the man you call king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Put him to death on the stake." He asked, "Why? What crime has he committed?" But they only shouted louder, "Put him to death on the stake." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the mob, set Barabbas free for them. But he had Yeshua whipped and handed him over to be executed on the stake. Just to say that I deliberately left in the way it's worded in here on the stake, because just to point out to people that if you're Jewish, the cross is an extremely negative word because of what's happened all down the centuries. So they don't talk about crucifixion and they don't talk about the cross, because it's like talking about the gas oven. Has a very bad resonance for any Jews. So the Hebrew versions the Messianic versions tend to translate it in different ways. They do not use the cross.
Thanks, Edmund. So I think we've referenced this before, that the Sanhedrin officially had to meet during the daytime. And so early in the morning they met. And then, as we also referenced previously, the Roman courts opened at sunrise. So again, very early in the morning. Now, apparently the Romans had no interest in blasphemy. So any of the claims that the chief priests had of why they were upset, of, the blasphemy of Jesus claiming to be Messiah, would have had no interest to Pilate. But they did have a lot of interest in treason, which was a capital crime. So that's why they described him as the king of the Jews, because that would imply he was setting himself up in opposition to Caesar. Any thoughts on that, Edmundo?
I'll probably come back to that a bit later on when we're doing something else.
So
I was going to say, just on the Sanhedrin bit, I read somewhere that it wasn't just one thing that they actually got wrong. There was about 12. 12 items of law that they broke in that meeting.
All right.
There are 12. There are a number of rules. So it was at night. The high priest forced Jesus to perjure himself.
You missed the discussion during the week where we differentiated, and looking at 15 verse 1.
Yeah.
Where it's very popular among evangelicals to talk about them breaking all the rules, but they're mixing up two parts of the event. The thing that was held at night was not a trial.
Right.
It was an arraignment meeting to decide what the form of legal thing they would take to Pilate, which is why there's all the discussion about the witnesses trying to get to. So they're trying to think, what's the basis on which we can present a case? So it says, as soon as it was morning, they held a council meeting with the elders. That's the official one where it's now daylight. They can have a proper one. The one before, which is why it's at the high priest's house, is not a formal.
Yeah. I was going to say that couldn't have been a formal one because there are at least 12 things that they broke.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, don't worry. So apparently Pilate lived in Caesarea Maritima, but resided in Herod's palace when he was in Jerusalem. And for any major feast, he would have come up to Jerusalem. Apparently Pilate came to Israel in AD 26. He was there for 10 years and was extremely harsh on the population. He had a very low opinion of the Jews, which is not the best thing to have as your person in charge, your procurator. So the thing about the setting someone free, apparently all Roman imperial magistrates could pardon and acquit individual prisoners in response to the shouts of the populace. So any imperial magistrate could go to a crowd and present the claims against someone, and even if they believed that they were guilty, if the crowd expressed that they wanted them to be free, they could set them free. So the crowd that was there was likely there to petition for Barabbas, as so few people would have known that Jesus was even present because it happened through the night. And the commentator says there is no way, this crowd was in no way representative of the triumphal entry crowd. And I think we do tend to fall into the trap of thinking, there was a crowd on the entry into Jerusalem, and this is the same crowd, and how fickle are people that they changed their opinion over a few days. And
they're completely different.
Completely different crowd. One's a crowd of people coming in from the country, from Galilee for the festival, and then this is a local crowd who knew Barabbas was in prison and came to petition for his release. So there was no way that they were particularly inclined towards Jesus, and they were probably highly likely to be sympathizers of the Zealots. Now, an interesting thing that I heard was Barabbas, son of the father.
Yeah.
Which is so ironic, isn't it? So you've got the son of the father and the son of man.
In fact, a lot of the traditions say that his first name was actually Yeshua Barabbas.
Yes, Jesus, yeah. So yes, son of the father, as opposed to son of God or son of man.
And if you've seen the film Barabbas, they make quite a play of the parallel. Anthony Quinn, is it?
I didn't even know there was a film.
Oh, yes, it's one of those big biblical epics. I really like the film, actually, but he can never forget this. And at the end of the film, he recognizes him as the Messiah. But it's one of those classic Hollywood biblical epics. It's brilliant. It's very good, actually. I enjoy that.
It's got Anthony Quinn in it. It must be really old.
I think Mark is making the same thing with the pun or the play on words.
Yep.
you know, that's there for the hearers. When Mark gives you a name, it's there for a reason.
Yes.
There were other people or just other people, you know, it doesn't really matter. But that was, it's not like he liked Barabbas particular, but that name was so that the juxtaposition of the two.
Yeah.
I'm always intrigued by the bit you were saying earlier that, you know, it seems to be, I mean, Josephus certainly and all sorts of people say how horrendous Pilate was, and yet that doesn't quite fit with the Pilate. If you saw him just here,
no.
He seems a little more flexible than he's always given word for. And I do wonder whether later historians, you know, it's in their interest to paint him in that way, and it's in their interest to paint the Jews because politically the Jews had fallen out of favor beginning to fall out of favor. And by the time you get to Constantine, they are very definitely out of favor. So no one's going to say positive things about. So I've always wondered, because I can't see a real point in the gospel writers saying that because they all say it, that he said, this doesn't seem to fit. Surely, don't you want your king? I mean, he's trying to appeal to but he doesn't realize what's actually going on behind. But it doesn't quite fit with this dreadful Pilate.
Yeah, I mean, the commentator says that, you know, he was famous for his antipathy to the Jews, and because of that, he would not have wanted to go along with the high priest's plans.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that would work.
He would have done anything to stymie their plans.
Wind them up.
Yeah, going.
I see. Well, that's an argument. I haven't thought of that one, but that is an argument. I'm not sure how convinced I am, but that would work.
Yeah, going to the crowd and saying, well, you know, do you want your king? It's like, it's almost, you know, sarcasm, isn't it? You know, this is your king, you know.
Don't you want your king? Don't you want your king?
Well, that follows through to the superscription on the cross.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where the chief priest complained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, it wasn't that he was recognizing and acknowledging Jesus was the king of the Jews, but he was making a point that, you know, look at what I've done to the king of the Jews. Dan, did you have a question?
Yeah. Just for my interest, is in verse 2, when Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? The phrasing that the answer that Jesus gives, it's a bit, to me, it's not so straightforward. He says, you have said so. It doesn't say, I am.
It's an idiom, and they translate it. I always think they translate it very poorly, because it always feels rather clumsy in different gospels, the way it's put, and different translations. But it's when you're asked a formal question of significance, almost like the Native American Indian at the end of something important would say, I have spoken. It's a formal, you are saying as a legal point, this is a key statement. But I always think that why on earth don't they say, which would capture all the different variants that different people comment on it, as you say.
The New King James says that, Edmund.
Sorry?
The New King James says, it is as you say.
Oh, do they? It is as you say. Oh, I'd forgotten that when I read it years ago. It is as you say. I think that's less clumsy than all the other ones and makes more sense to us reading it now. But I mean, I'm just,
the Greek in there, he's and answering to him, he says, you have said.
Mm.
So, see legeis.
Yeah.
You have said.
But it was a form they were very familiar with in serious discussions. But it just sounds a little odd to us. So I thought,
Yeah, and the the chief priests are accusing him, and Pilate asks him, aren't you going to answer? Because, Pilate, this wasn't his first rodeo. He'd sat in front of people who were being accused before and seen how everyone automatically does everything they can to justify and explain themselves. And Jesus just stands there and doesn't make an argument. That must have really, made a point.
But it was like I was saying the other week, remember, we talked about it, that Jesus will always defend other people, but he never responds to an accusation. And I can't find him responding to an accusation. He just stays quiet. He never defends himself. And when I got into these discussions, it was people sort of, when you were talking about anger, and they always say, well, Jesus got angry. And it always used to be very difficult to answer that until I saw other places in the Gospels where Jesus was angry, and you put the three together, and all of a sudden you see he's angry with the disciples because they're denying the children a blessing. And he's angry in the synagogue because they're leaving a woman who could, or either the man with the woman with the withered hand or the woman bent over. I can't quite remember which one it was, but they are saying because of the rules, you can't heal her. So they're denying her the gift of God again. And so when you've got those two, you then realize that when he's in the temple and he's angry, it's because the Gentiles are being deprived of their access to God. He's never angry on his own account, as far as I can see. And that fits in with this. He will, if you ask him a question, he will answer, but he will not defend himself or reply to an accusation.
Now, this is, Mark has got quite a short version. Luke has Pilate sending Jesus on to Herod for investigation as well, in Luke 23. But again, Herod finds no reason to condemn him and sends him back to Pilate. And I think it's interesting, it says in Luke 23:12, that day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they'd been enemies. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting. So I think when you look at all the Synoptic and John's account, all the gospel writers tried to make it very clear that Pilate really didn't see any reason to execute Jesus. However, the commentator does make one comment as to why maybe he didn't stand up to the crowd more. Apparently, Pilate's own patron, Sejanus, had been executed by Tiberius in AD 31, and so Pilate could not afford to be seen to be light on claims of high treason. So he was his patron had been executed, so he was in a bit of more of an exposed position. And so, I think in one of the accounts, the high priest said, do you want to be a friend of Caesar's?
Yeah.
And so he would have been worried, oh no, if I do let this guy go, and then they go behind my back and say, we brought
friend of Caesar was a particular title, a special title. And if that got undermined, that would not be good for him, as you say.
Yeah, if they'd have gone behind his back and said, we brought someone on a accusation of sedition and he didn't do anything about it, he would have felt probably a bit more exposed because he didn't have someone in the court who was his protector. So, any questions, comments on this whole thing? Jesus before Pilate, and then he hands him over to be crucified.
Just something that isn't necessarily in this version. Is it in John, where it talks about the pavement, the Gabbatha?
Gabbatha, yeah.
I've seen slightly different figures, but there's not a lot of people that can be in that place, which fits with what Simon said at the beginning about, this was not the normal crowd. It was quite a small group of people. The biggest number I've seen it possible to. They found the Gabatha, by the way. They know where it is, and the numbers I've seen range from about 250 to 300 up to 600, but most say around 400, 450. So it's not a big group of people if you think that's what we've got on a Sunday in the Forum on a good day.
Yeah, that's in John 13. Sorry, John 19:13.
Yeah, I thought it was John.
Yeah.
There's a piece on Wikipedia about it.
Is there? Oh.
Yeah.
Is it accurate?
It's Wikipedia. It's in the region of. I don't know. I haven't read it, but.
Yeah. Wikipedia is good for some information, isn't it? But not always for the detail.
It's a start, but.
Yeah. So, Edmund, I'm going to share my screen again and we can move on. Edmund, could you read Mark 16 to 32, please?
Right, 32. Right, that goes up to there, yes. Okay. A certain man from Cyrene.
From 16, Edmund.
Oh, sorry, I've jumped a paragraph. The soldiers led him away inside the palace, and that is the headquarters building, and called together the whole battalion. They dressed him in purple and wove thorn branches into a crown, which they put on him. Then they began to salute him. Hail to the King of the Jews! Then they hit him on the head with a stick, spat on him, and kneeled in mock worship of him. And when they'd finished ridiculing him, they took off the purple robe, put his own clothes back on him, and led him away to be nailed to the execution stake. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the stake. They brought Yeshua to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, and they gave him wine spiced with myrrh, but he didn't take it. Then they nailed him to the execution stake, and they divided his clothes among themselves, throwing dice to determine what each man should get. It was 9 a.m. when they nailed him to the stake. Over his head, the written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." On execution stakes with him, they placed 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left. People passing by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha! So you can destroy the temple, can you, and rebuild it in 3 days? Save yourself and come down from the stake." Likewise, the head priests and the Torah teachers made fun of him, saying to each other, he saved others, but he can't save himself. And so he's the Messiah, is he, the King of Israel? Let him come down now from the stake. If we see that, then we'll believe him. Even the men nailed up with him insulted him.
Thanks, Edmund. So we're reaching the pinnacle of the story. Mark doesn't go into a lot of detail on the crucifixion because it was such a well-known event, particularly in that part of the world. It was regularly used to terrorize the population, and as an example, Cicero called crucifixion the grossest, cruelest, and most hideous manner of execution. And Josephus called it the most wretched of all ways of dying. And we get our English word excruciating from it.
Oh, I hadn't thought that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so excruciating. However, the commentator says it was the customary way of preserving public order in the provinces. The public exposure of an executed person branded him as one cursed by God to the Jews in accordance with the provision of Deuteronomy 21:23. He is accursed of God who hangs on a tree. Simon of Cyrene's sons are named would indicate Mark expected his first readers to know who they were.
Yeah.
Because as Dave said, he wouldn't have he didn't put detail in that wasn't important. So the Christians in Rome must have known who they were.
Mm.
So
Rufus is mentioned. I think it's the letter to the Romans, but I meant to look it up, but in the end I didn't get round to it. But there's and some commentators link the two. It says Rufus and his mother, I think.
I mean, there must have been a reason for Mark to write it.
Yeah.
But, I've sort of skipped over a bit on the soldiers mocking Jesus. Have you got anything on that?
Yeah, well, I've seen two sort of versions of it, and really, in a way, they sort of fit together. So it's a sort of parody. There was a whole ceremony of when Caesar was proclaimed in front of the people for the first time. You went through certain things which would take place, and I've seen someone go through it and show the connections here. They're mocking as if he was a Caesar and what have you. Only Caesars could wear, only kings could wear the purple sort of thing and that sort of thing. And the way in which they take a sort of bodged version of various things, crowning Caesar with a laurel wreath and what have you. I don't remember all the details, but it is meant to be a parody of the claim that he's a king. Mm. So the Roman soldiers do the sort of mockery of that to do with the way they would acclaim Caesar, basically.
Yeah.
I noticed that in quite a few of the versions, verse 28 is missing, where it says the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Why did they miss that out? Or was it not in the original?
The earliest, if my memory serves me right, I can never remember which is which, the Codex Sinaiticus or the Codex, whatever the other one's called, and it's in one and not in the other. Sometimes things, later ones, they add extra things to fill it out a bit more. We tend to always think about what was the original, but you might make it one, particularly if you think about the freer translations, putting things in to make a point more clear. They wouldn't see themselves as messing up the. So it tends to be in a later manuscript rather than the earlier ones.
Okay, so it's in the New King James, but it's not in the New Living Translation. I don't know. Right. It's not in the NIV, is it?
That's because the New King James and the original are actually from the same text source.
Yeah.
Whereas all the others are
from the other source.
Well, they will go and take on the manuscripts that New King James wouldn't use.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, reading the commentaries, it's very interesting how many tiny little variations there are amongst the different Greek sources. Yeah. And, as David said, now they tend to look at a lot of them and balance it out. I mean, in the NIV, they don't have that verse, but it does say some manuscripts have that. It's a footnote in the NIV. But it is really interesting because, you had like the sort of Eastern Church documents, you had like the Egyptian Church documents, you had the Roman Church documents. So they all started to slightly drift, but not significantly. There's nothing major. There's just little nuances. And I think the translators now are very good at letting you know when there are options.
Yeah.
Um,
They will never totally disappear. They will always be in a footnote, or they will be italicized or bracketed. But they are recognized. Usually they're like commentary within the text.
Yeah.
That's how they recognize them usually.
I've been very struck because most folk will probably know that I sit in on a Messianic congregation for some two lengthy Bible studies a week, Friday night and Saturday afternoon. And he very definitely, bless him, dear Wayne, he is very clear on what translations he is happy with and what he is not. And he does not like one of the particular source ones. I think it's the Codex Sinaiticus. And he was talking about, there are lots of scribblings all over it and emendations and additions and all sorts of things. If you've got one that's based on that, and he always checks a certain verse in Revelation, depending on how that's translated, that will tell you which one they've used. Throw it away, throw your Bible away. He does not like the NIV.
Doesn't he?
No. NIV is the next best thing to having come from the devil. But
what does he use then?
He uses the I think it's the New King James. He mostly uses, but he will refer to the others. But the trouble is, I saw a documentary on the Codex. I haven't told Wayne I'd seen it, on the Codex Sinaiticus.
Yes, you might get banned.
I was absolutely blown away by this document. And when I saw it, the pages set out, and what it reminded me of, if you've ever seen a picture of the Talmud with the scripture text in the middle, and then you've got the commentary written around it, and various different rabbis and what they said on the passage spread all over the page. And I looked at this code, and it's beautiful. There's not a crossing out anywhere on any of the pages I saw on the documentary. And it's done in a different ink. And when I looked at it, I thought, these are alternate readings from other, that's what it is. It's not a, do you know what I mean? And it just reminded me so much of a Jewish Talmud.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought he's completely come from his tradition, Baptist tradition, although being Messianic, that was an interesting conflict when he was at college. But do you know what I mean? It's what's been handed down to him. And I think if he saw the document, he might think, oh.
What did you say it's from a Baptist tradition?
Well, I haven't heard how he became a believer, but he's been a believer for many.
I thought it was a Messianic Jewish.
Yes.
Group.
Yes,
How
but
how did he come through the Baptists?
Well, when you get saved as a Jew, there weren't at that stage. He's quite an old man.
Right,
Messianic,
so right.
Messianic congregations. So you would then, if you're really stirred up, you want to study, so you go to Bible study, and it was he said he did used to disturb his tutors a bit, because he always wanted to be studying the Bible, not what the traditional way of Baptist theology. And they weren't used to actually referring to the Bible all the time. They just wanted to, this is the way we teach it, and this is what we hand on to our students, which he says is quite understandable, but it didn't suit him.
Yeah, right, okay. So yes, when we get into chapter 16, we'll find this, because in the NIV, from 9 to 20, verses 9 to 20, it just says in brackets, the earliest manuscripts and some of the ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16, 9 to 20. My commentator didn't even have a chapter on it.
Well, I've got one translation, one edition, which has, I think, 5 different, including the one we're used to, but 2 or 3 of them I'd never seen anywhere else, but they are alternative endings for Mark.
Yes, he actually, the commentator did have some comments on some of the other endings, but not the one that we have in the NIV.
Yes.
So it's quite interesting. So we will cross that bridge when we come to it. But yeah, that's the kind of the main example of it within our Bibles.
Yeah.
Because it's such a large passage, and actually has, some of it's red letter, and so it's it's supposed to be from directly what Jesus said, and in fact, in Mark, it's the final. If you take that ending, it is the final things that Jesus says in the gospel. So on going back into our passage, verse 23. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And apparently, according to tradition, respected women of Jerusalem offered a narcotic drink to the condemned in order to decrease their sensitivity to pain. This was in response to Proverbs 31:6 and 7, which is, let beer be for those who are perishing, wine for those who are in anguish. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. So off the back of that passage, some of the well-to-do, pious ladies of Jerusalem would provide this narcotic drink to help soothe the anguish of crucifixion. But Jesus didn't drink it.
One of the other Gospels, Jesus says, weep not for we women of Jerusalem, weep for yourselves, in effect, because of what is coming. And when Jesus says, one of the old translations says, when you do your alms, do them in secret, don't do them in front of people, in the Sermon on the Mount. Well, that word alms is tzedakah, deeds of righteousness. And that's more the way that an observant Jew would see what we call commands, their actions of righteousness. And therefore, you're quite enthusiastic about finding some arena where you can do these tzedakah. And these women who were used to accompany, particularly when they didn't have family or what have them, or anyone with them, they would go to executions to lament before God on behalf of these people who might not have other people with them, and to help them. And that was seen as a great deed of mercy, because of course the person dying would never be in a position to repay them. So this was a free will offering from them to them with no expectation of a reward, which is a very high level tzedakah.
Going back to our discussion we were just having about versions, my commentator says that the third, in 25, it was the third hour when they crucified him, is quite possibly an early gloss, because it doesn't fit in with what some of the other, with the timeline and with what John says about it being the 6th hour. So that's another example of one that is a possible slight wobble. The commentator says that the cross was often low so that the feet almost touched the ground, and that it was only when they wanted to make a warning statement that the cross was high. And Jesus' cross appears to have been high, as the soldiers needed a reed to reach his lips. And in the NIV, it says robbers, but I noticed that when Edmund read out the thing I put up, had what does it call them? Rebels. So in the version, the NIV version on Bible Hub, it refers to them as rebels, not thieves.
Yeah,
And
that's probably a better translation. The rebel,
yeah, I think.
insurgents. If we would nowadays, because we're used to the sort of thing with militant Islam.
Yeah.
The word we use, I'm trying to think what it was that we use these days, but that fits that Greek word very well.
Yeah, because theft wasn't a capital crime.
No.
But insurgency was.
I think as well that the crucifixion was really about making a statement about keeping insurrection down. And so it was kind of reserved, that's my understanding, it was kind of reserved for that particular thing, just off with her head or run them through with something, or stoning, or one of those type of things were lesser executions in one sense, if you can have a lesser execution. But yeah, that's how I understand it. Sorry?
You can have a much quicker, less painful execution.
Yes, yeah.
Because often people could survive for days.
Yes.
It was really not very pleasant. Interesting. Oh, go on.
I'm finding myself having a more kind of emotional response to this, because I think it's really interesting, the details. But I'm sort of, as I'm reading them, I'm thinking, so why are they here? If it's just about substitutionary atonement, then he could have just got on the cross and it was an infinite significance. But we've got all these details here, and I don't know if anyone else is like this, but I find the suffering of the world really hard. I find it really hard thinking about children being abused, and sex trafficking and horrendous stuff. The older you get, the more you read, the more you know. And I think as well, because my husband was really ill several years ago, but I find it really moving and really helpful, these details about the mockery and the difficulty and the sort of the anguish that he was in. I just see such an incredible identification with human suffering here. I mean, I know I'm stating the obvious, but that's what I'm really getting from this, all these funny little details. I think for me, that's what they're for. I've picked up a book that's sort of sitting on my floor, reminding me about another another atonement model that a guy called Hans von Balthasar. I always get his name way back. Yeah.
Have you got that book? Can I borrow it?
Yeah, I haven't. He's quoted in another book. But he really takes up this idea that Jesus and the crucifixion is really majoring on God's solidarity with humanity, and says here that he willingly bears humanity's sin and despair and God-forsakenness, and he does it with body, mind and soul, not wanting to avoid any aspect of suffering that humanity suffers. So I think I'm just sort of throwing that in. For me, these details are quite helpful in kind of, yes, attaching me to another role, another model of atonement. Not saying that I'm denying the substitutionary one, but yeah.
It strikes me that you pick up on that, because I have thought about that very centrally, because I found that my experience of seeing it like that, if you like, when I found myself among a whole bunch of disabled people doing Bible studies, it was very interesting that was a central thing for almost all of them without thinking. And when you think about Johnny, who broke her neck, Joni, however you say her name.
Yeah.
And I mean, she talks very powerfully, a book way years ago when she was still quite young. But of course, she's a quadriplegic. And so her whole body is like pinned. And she suddenly realized Jesus on the cross was a quadriplegic. he could not move, he
Yeah.
could not, and her sense of just absolute wonder and oh, he did this for me was very, very real. And I've seen that in other disabled people, that they almost, it seems to me now, I'm sure there must be exceptions, but I notice over and over again, the thing they zone in on, you know, him being crucified is like me being disabled. So the identification is very, very powerful. So I'm interested to hear you mention it outside of the realm where I almost always see it.
Yeah. I think the other thing about, I was talking to someone today about it, and that very often we tend to be quite geared up to penal substitution as an atonement model, but in fact there are 7 models, and lots of people very often talk about them in competition. Yeah. But in fact, they're actually they're different ways of looking at the same event. Absolutely. And they're complementary, of which penal substitution is probably the key one, but they all have a dramatic, you know, they are a very important thing. And I think probably we've turned down the volume on the other ones, like Christus Victor or the scapegoat theory, those types of things, and turned up penal substitution. We probably need to get on the EQs and adjust the EQs of our atonement theory a little bit.
There's more than one instrument in the orchestra playing what God was about. Yeah. And I've been thinking about it particularly because, of course, Passover's coming up. Yeah. And there's a couple of people that I listen in on for stuff, and they're talking about Jesus was the Lamb, behold the Lamb. And they're talking exclusively, it just so happens, as Jesus as the Passover Lamb, which of course he was. But when John says, behold the Lamb, in the beginning of the gospel, I mean, my instant thing there, he's talking about, he's the one that bears away the sins of the world. Well, that's the scapegoat, not the Passover Lamb. So when I hear these people talking about Jesus, yes, he is the Passover Lamb, but I would say that first and foremost, I go to the scapegoat, because of, you know, the John the Baptist pieces and what have you. I think he's talking about the scapegoat, but he's talking about the scapegoat and he's talking about the Passover and whatever other lamb you want to choose. I was thinking about Abraham, and the wording in the Hebrew is extraordinary, because when he turns to the ram that's behind him caught in the bush, that behind has a very unusual double meaning to it. You know, he's coming after me, which could be behind, but it can also mean in the future. So that behind at the, you know, when Isaac is about to be offered up, also carries a prophetic, as far as Jews are concerned, pointing to the one who will come in the future. And that's another ram caught in the... So I see all of those 3 as equally important. I don't want to say it's just this one or just that one in exactly the way that you just said about the different versions of what the cross was about. I think it's all of those, and I look through different windows and see different things, but they're all windows, they're different windows to the same house.
Yeah.
Yes. So, the 29, those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourselves." Well, Jesus never said that, did he?
But it is around, because it's mentioned in the arraignment.
It's mentioned in the arraignment, but you just wonder whether these people passing by had been actually at the arraignment, because they hadn't had an awful lot of time for it to spread through the city, had they? Because it was late at night. This was early in the morning. This was the morning. So I'm not sure they were just idle passers-by. I think they were possibly...
stooges.
Yeah, been there a bit a bit more involved than.
Yeah, well, you know, because it says that the high priest was there, and all the people that had been at that, so it's their cronies have come along as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? They weren't just happy that they got him on a cross. They actually wanted to come and ridicule him as well. There was that level of antipathy towards him.
But you want the people to understand what the official version is. So it's for the sake of the people that are all around that they're saying this, to underline their point.
Yeah, all right, justifying why they've done it.
This is how you are to read this situation.
Right.
We let you know what this is about. Are you hearing properly? This is the official story.
And it's also underlining the fact that, of course, a dead Messiah is no Messiah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Yes, because like they say, if you come down, we'll believe in you.
It's interesting, one little point, which actually gives you a parallel in Mark, but if you look in others, do you see where it says when they're mocking him, likewise the head priest and the Torah teachers made fun of him, saying to each other, he saved others, he can't save himself. And so he's the Messiah, is he, the King of Israel? Well, obviously they're a parallel, right? They're saying the same thing. But in other versions, if you remember when we talked about the tradition has always been that Son of God relates to divinity, Son of Man relates to humanity. And I explained why actually we've got that exactly backwards. And if you look in the other versions of this incident, they say, he said he was the Messiah, the Son of God. So that is a royal title like King of Israel. That's one of the places where you see it, is here. It actually says King of Israel here, but other ones it says Son of God. So it's, again, the parallel, the King of Israel, Son of God, Shepherd of Israel. He had various titles, but they were royal titles. And it goes back to Solomon specifically, but you can also see it with David when he's being told about it.
Well, we're going to stop at the end of 32 because when we get into 33, I don't want to rush it. So we'll go in from 33 next week. Does anybody have any final questions or comments or thoughts?
I just one thing that struck me ages ago, and it's with the soldiers. When they put not only the robe, but the crown of thorns. So obviously the laurel crown for Caesar, but that whenever I read the crown of thorns, it always takes me back to Genesis chapter 3, and the curse on the ground for thorns. And there are about 12 mentions of thorns all the way through the Old Testament. But I wonder whether, unbeknown, the soldiers in crowning him took what was supposed to be man's crowning in when God gave him the be fruitful, multiply, subdue the garden, grow the garden. That would be his crowning glory, we might say. And he took the crowns that came from his sin and placed it on his head.
Wow. Hadn't thought of that.
That's good.
I don't know. I wouldn't push it too far, but
no, but you're allowed to do that. It's called sword, I think, in Jewish interpretation. Very good, perfectly valid.
Yeah, I mean, there's with all these things, like Olivia said, why? Why is that there? No one was doing anything that God didn't ordain in all this.
Yeah.
And so, why the crown of thorns? Why the royal robe? Why the detail?
The reason why I thought about it as well is that certainly the Jews would be well soaked in Torah. And so, even if it was thorns in Greek, there is a parallel word in Hebrew, and the word would just, if you were sort of more or less bilingual, you would have, or you were, you know, it certainly
They'd know all the references.
Yeah, they'd know the references up. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
When we finished, I shall go hunting in Job, because I know there's something in Job about thorns. But now you've set me off.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know, David, if you were articulating this fully or not, but I'm hearing from that thing of thorns, there's definitely the referencing to Genesis 3 and the ground being cursed. But Jesus, by wearing that, I think there's a reference to the kind of a really expansive eschatology that includes the new heavens and the new earth. And Romans 8, the whole of creation is groaning. So often in the West, we look at the crucifixion as something that's just about humanity and we're going to be saved, all these individual people, or maybe the church, and we'll be with Jesus forever. But actually, that's not completely biblical. The biblical vision is the whole earth is going to be renewed, a new heavens and a new earth. And so I just sort of feel like Jesus is taking into himself the curse that's upon the actual earth, and it's a reference to the resurrection that is going to come to the whole creation in the, you know, Revelation.
You're being very Celtic again.
I
must get her to read the Carmina. Have you come across the Carmina Gadelica?
No, I'm being biblical. I'm being biblical.
The huge collection of spiritual writings about the creation and God from the Celtic.
Yes, but it was brought to my attention today by someone I was listening to on a podcast, and you know, the shorter Westminster Catechism says that the chief end of man is to enjoy God, and what is it? To love God and enjoy Him forever. Yeah, and this guy went, no, well, that's actually not what not what God said to humanity in the beginning. It was go forth and multiply, you know, in our image and have dominion, steward the earth. So actually, it's not just about us relating to God, it's about us relating to God in a kingdom, and that kingdom is going to be realized fully in a very tangible way, in a concrete way. And that's why Jesus had a body as well. God is really into redeeming matter, and this matter matters.
It's much easier for us. It's much easier for us because we're now at a stage where we're aware of the boundary of the creation. That if you'd said to people 100 years ago that we could affect the creation, they had an almost sense of the infiniteness. So no matter how many whales we take, you know, they couldn't envisage destroying all the animals on the earth. Whereas we're now in a space where we're very much aware, even if because we're so disconnected from creation, that you know, the creation is vulnerable, and so we can see that the people who did the Westminster Catechism, the earth, the creation was something way, way mysterious and infinitely beyond them. Yeah. So they wouldn't have been.
Tom Rice is very good on this about the physical recreation, renewal of the earth physically in his book called Surprised by Hope. It's really very, very good on that. Very good indeed. It's a major way in which I think evangelicalism sort of got it wrong. It's all this Gnostic thing that we're going to be floating around with spirits. That's an ultimate destiny, which of course is not true. Our ultimate destiny is physical resurrection and renewal.
Well, that's the whole sort of Hollywood thing of, you know, us all sitting on clouds playing harps, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's just Platonism recooked. Yeah.
Yes.
But basically, what you described there, Olivia, really was both Christus Victor and the ransom theory of atonement. So it's back into this room, looking into the same thing from different angles. When we pull that together, we get a much richer atonement understanding, I think, when we begin to keep them together. Don't separate them apart.
Yeah.
They look different, but I think I'm working my way through this at the moment, just thinking about it. So,
right, guys, I'm going to turn off the